Welcome back to another episode of Talk Lex podcast. I'm Scott Peterson. I'm here with Giovanna. This is take three because I misstated something to begin with, and Giovanna corrected me, and then I accidentally turned it off. If you like this podcast and would like to subscribe, please do so. Please leave us a 5-star review. If you have questions, feel free to reach out to us on Instagram at Talk Lex Podcast. This is brought to you by DeRazio Peterson, a personal injury and employment law firm. And if you have questions about any of that, feel free to visit our website at DeRazioPeterson.com or reach out to us on the socials. So we are talking this week about a few different stories where we started, and what prompted me our retake here is an article in the Athletic magazine about a story involving an Ole Miss freshman woman and Pat McAfee, who is a commentator for ESPN. Backstory here is that The Athletic is, for those who don't know, a website that publishes what I would call kind of well-written content about sports and sports-related stories. The Athletic published a story this morning about a young woman at Ole Miss who was accused on a site called Yik Yak, which I've never heard of. Have you heard of this?
No.
Okay, of having an affair with her boyfriend's father. Okay, freshman in college gets accused online of having an affair with her boyfriend's father. This spins out and becomes apparently a big story on the internet and X and all the other cesspools. Pat McAfee, who has got one of the biggest shows on ESPN, then picks it up and leads his show a couple weeks ago, or a little over a month ago, leads his show with a segment talking about the girl at Ole Miss who's having an affair with her, or allegedly having an affair with her boyfriend's father. From there, it spirals out even more. And long story short, this young woman has received death threats, has basically had to go online. And the story is about how it basically this has ruined her life. And the long and the short of it is that it wasn't true to begin with. And so the Athletic article is really kind of highlighting this world that we're now in, where these quote unquote journalists republish or repost or talk about theories and stories that they've heard on the internet that end up not being true, and for which they've done no actual investigation. And they talk about them or republish them in the context of, hey, what do I know? And so this is trying to put a human face on what actually happens when these stories go viral and when these folks with these massive audiences, I think McAfee has like 2.5 or 3 million listeners or viewers on his YouTube show or his digital show. And what actually happens when they republish this. So you read the article. What do you think? And then we'll kind of get into the legal part of it.
As you know, this article caused me to get the rage. I mean, I have a lot of thoughts. Some of them are legal, others are not. I mean, she has lawyered up at this point, as she should. This is false, according to, she's saying this is false. So from a legal perspective, we try to explain a little bit what, the legal issues are in these types of cases. That would be a defamation case. He never named her in the what is it a podcast? What's he doing?
It's like a
Like a
no, it's not a
show?
podcast. It's one of it. It's kind of like a Joe Rogan show, except it's usually just him. Sometimes he has guests, but it's a live show, and he's in a very casual studio. My friends and I, just a quick aside, I have a text thread with some friends, and one of them loves Pat McAfee, and two of us are always making fun of him because the guy, in my opinion, is kind of a knucklehead, and he never wears sleeves. He's always got a cut-off shirt on, and we're always making fun of him for not having sleeves on.
Oh,
Uh,
so ironic. You too were wearing cut off sleeves the first time we met.
that's false, and I may have a claim as well.
That is not
Go back into your
that is a fact.
assessment.
Okay. All right. So I do think it's relevant to talk about some of like the societal problems that are encompassed within this issue. But from starting off from more of a legal perspective, you're going to sue somebody for defamation. They say something false about you that trashes your reputation. That's what the definition of defamation is. Um, he did not say her name on his show. That does not matter, at least in the state of New York. If you are able to infer the identity of the defamed person from the context, um, that you can have a claim for defamation. So it doesn't matter that he didn't say her name. Probably the most, an example that we've discussed on this podcast before is the Johnny Depp trial. When Amber Heard wrote an op-ed about him, she never named him. But it was obvious that that's who she was talking about. So, just another point about defamation is she is a private person. There's no indication to me that she's one of these, a lot of, like, in this day and age, some of the students at colleges become influencers and have a really public platform. That's not my understanding of this girl. I think she's just a private person. In New York, the standard in defamation for private people is pretty low. It's only negligence. So I think that this sounds like a good defamation case to me, and I hope that she wins, which takes me to my rage about what happened to this poor girl. It's outrageous to me, the shitstorm that this lie set off for her, perpetuated by grown men. She is a child. As a parent of kids who are teenagers, like, they are children. Um, and these are grown men talking about a teenage girl. Um, and she has been threatened. She has been harassed off of her campus. She had to go to online classes. Then a student in her online class screenshotted, like, a writing sample and perpetuated that on the internet. In my opinion, that person should be expelled. Um, I just, like, everything that has happened to her since this is grotesque. Grown men calling her on her phone and leaving her, like, disgusting sexual messages, somebody calling the police and sending them to her house, that they showed up at her mother's house with, like, guns drawn and some sort of, like, swatting thing. Um, it's just totally outrageous. I mean, like, I can't even wrap my mind around. I mean, I can wrap my mind around this happening because with social media now, and this was perpetuated on X, which I think that was where it really gained its traction. We know that they dropped basically all their fact checking in the guise of free speech. Oh, the irony. And this perpetuated on there, then it got picked up, and it says this in the article, and her father, I think, has said this, or she has said this in interviews, which is that this really became a lot worse when the people with the big platforms like this guy and Barstool picked this up and started talking about it on a really big platform that, you and I have had this conversation because sometimes we have a little bit of a difference of opinion about podcasts putting people on who, maybe you're giving a platform to somebody who might have some kind of, like, fringe ideas. And, like, we kind of go back and forth between, like, you need to listen to people who have a different opinion of you. And then, like, am I giving a platform to somebody who doesn't deserve it? And I think what I sometimes say is that when you give someone a platform, you legitimize them. And a lot of, and I'm not saying this is necessarily the same thing, but her point is that when people with this really big platform started perpetuating this rumor, it legitimized it and made it truth in a lot of people's minds. And ultimately, people with these really big platforms, I don't think they feel like they have a responsibility to other people, unfortunately, but they do, because people, I think it's human nature to feel that if you have this enormous platform, the reason why you have that is because you have some modicum of credibility, whether that's true or false.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting time because there's so many people like this who are out in this world, and there's no accountability for any of the things that they're saying. And that's all well and good until something like this happens. And this happens more than people think. And somebody gets targeted, or God forbid, is the victim of violence or something like that. I was just listening to an interview on the Fresh Air podcast yesterday with a writer for the New Yorker who wrote a piece about uh, the quote unquote manosphere, and how, this was in the context of politics, but it was about how, can Democrats win back some of the men who they lost in the last election? And part of the topic of that was people listening to, Joe Rogan and Theo Vaughn, and, I would almost put McAfee in this category, even though he's talking about sports, but these podcasters who and commentators who sort of enter into this world saying, what do I know? I'm just asking questions. And, again, that's fine, except you have to recognize that you've got some social or moral or ethical responsibility. And there's obviously never going to be regulation about this. So the reason we wanted to talk about it was because the legal system is the way that this levels off. I mean, this is you want to talk about free market, capitalism or free market control. This is how the free market corrects itself, because there's been an extreme I don't want to call it overcorrection, but an extreme movement to, allow everybody who has any kind of comment to say whatever they want to whatever audience they want. So that's all well and good, but there's real world consequences. And how do we pull it back? Well, if we're not going to regulate it at a government level, the best way to regulate it is through lawsuits. And the way you do that through lawsuits is by suing someone with these kinds of platforms for making statements that aren't true. Now, we obviously don't know this one. We don't know if this is, if what he said is false. All we know is that, according to the article, at least, everyone involved from her side says it is false. So the best thing to do, in my opinion, is you file these kinds of claims, let a jury hear the proof, and let them decide. And maybe they zing the person who made these comments, or the people, with big jury verdicts, and that teaches people to be a little bit more careful about what they say. This comes up, like, this is what happened in the context of all the lawsuits arising out of the 2020 election, when people were accusing companies of fixing the election, and election workers of destroying ballots, and all this kind of crazy talk that ended up getting people sued and getting people hit for huge defamation verdicts, and perpetuating false, uninvestigated rumors. I don't know. It's very frustrating, and the article's good. I encourage anyone listening to go read it, because it doesn't put all the blame on Pat McAfee, but what it does, the article ends with a comment that McAfee himself made about how he's got a daughter and how he thinks of her. And it's like, if you don't see, hopefully he's reading it and seeing the irony in what happened here. Because if this were his daughter and somebody from Barstool or one of these other podcasts did what he did, he would probably be going crazy. So it's, I think the legal system is the way to address this, because I don't see any other way.
Yeah, I think unfortunately we're kind of in a place in time in social media, and I consider like X and these things to be social media, not just um, TikTok or whatever, but just places where people are just sharing information, and there's no real accountability. And now we're have even less fact checking than we ever had before. And I think the law is catching up, trying to catch up to see how are people who are victims of like a coordinated online harassment campaign and things like that, how are these people going to be, have any recourse, either from a civil perspective, or even, what is a crime and what's not a crime. In New York, we have this cause of action called intentional infliction of emotional distress that could potentially be, applicable in situations like this. Those cases, I think, notoriously up until maybe recently have been unsuccessful. It's like a very difficult claim to make with what the legal standard is, but that is something that may be able to come into play in the civil context in situations like this, in addition to defamation when something is false. I will just say a footnote to this. I don't even care if this was true. I still don't think they should have talked about it. Um, you know,
Well, yeah,
like
I mean,
putting aside the fact that, if it was true, I have a lot of issues about like, consent and like an imbalance of power between a freshman student and the father and a grown man, that would add like a whole layer of issue that probably, perhaps not in a men are bad sort of way, but maybe a man wouldn't think of it that way. You know what I mean? Like maybe when you start thinking about this and it's like a young girl and an older man, you're not thinking to yourself, you think this is like funny gossip, and you're not thinking like, no, wait, actually that would be like really disgusting, even if it was true. And even if it was like consensual, allegedly. But so I just feel like there's lines that, are kind of disappearing, like in our discourse, where grown men are sitting around talking about the alleged sex life of a teenage girl. It's just gross. And then, and like in New York, we really don't have a lot of civil recourse for stuff like this. Like we have a revenge porn law where somebody is going to share intimate images that were shared with them. There's some legislation to try to get some more protection for stalkers that are not, intimate partners. Like we don't really have um, a law directed to that at this point. So this is definitely something where the law is going to need to catch up, because I think she is definitely not alone in being the victim of a rumor going totally out of control and then causing genuine harm and safety, concerns.
Yep. And we were joking earlier that this has become like a podcast about defamation cases. And the strange thing about that is defamation cases aren't actually that common in day-to-day practice in civil litigation. We generally won't take them unless they're very severe, because they're actually kind of, they can be difficult to win. Although, if someone called me with a case like this, I would certainly be happy to take it on for principled purposes. But that it's a good tool to use in this environment. And so you may see more and more of these cases, because it's like we said, this is really the only way to address it, because there aren't a lot of avenues for someone to pursue when they're in a situation like this.
Yeah. And I mean, we've said this in other podcasts before. I mean, obviously, when it's a sensitive topic like this, you have to have a lot of communication with your attorney, because truth is a defense to defamation. And so you better make sure that you're, being honest with your attorney about whether something is true or false. They're saying this is false. There's at this point, no reason to believe otherwise. Her boyfriend says it's false. I'm sure the father says it's false.
Yeah, I'm sure
Um,
he does. Yeah.
and I just, and then there's like reference like he's like joking around at his in his show about like the dads at this college, like did you read that part? Like the dads at this college are like, I have like, this is like unrelated. I have a fascination with the culture of parents partying at their kids' colleges. Because as we get older, I'm starting to see this as like a phenomenon. And I would like to submit this to the Athletic as a topic of a future article.
Yeah, yeah. Big Southern schools, big popular thing. Um, all right, all right. Anyway, anything else on that one? We're gonna follow this story. This is early on. There hasn't been a lawsuit filed yet, but I'd be interested to see how it plays out. If she does sue him, it's going to be a huge story, because he has a popular show. He's not a guy that shies away from publicity, positive or negative. He's pretty famous for having had Aaron Rodgers, the now former Jets quarterback, on the show a number of times, where Rodgers was on there kind of talking about uh, ayahuasca and his kind of interesting and I would say non-mainstream views of things, and a lot that would often get repeated in various other outlets. So we'll see where it goes. All right, moving on. Walmart in trouble in the public. I don't think a lawsuit has been filed on this one yet, but an interesting case. A 6'4" woman was in a restroom at a Walmart take a wild guess,
Florida, Texas.
Florida. when a male entered the facility and began making derogatory remarks about transgender women, transgender individuals, saying that she posed a threat. So he was making comments of yelling about trannies, making threats about beating them up. The long and the short of it is the woman was actually not transgender, but apparently reported this incident to a supervisor and a week later was fired by Walmart. Oh man. For failing to escalate the issue to senior management, which they said was a security risk. I mean, okay, maybe
She
maybe this
got
is
fired because she didn't escalate it to senior management.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe this is like technically true. I'd be interested, you file a lawsuit, the first thing you say is, all right, give us the records of how many employees have been terminated because they failed to escalate a situation to senior management. And my guess is that
She reported it to somebody though.
supervisor, which is obviously senior, but not senior management. I don't know.
The supervisor is supposed to then escalate it. That's usually how it works.
Yeah. So, it's interesting. She went on social media, told the story. There's a lot of pushback against Walmart.
They've offered her her job back multiple times, allegedly.
Yeah, well, that brings up I've sort of two comments on this, and I guess questions for you. And this comes up in the context of litigation sometimes, which is it's not uncommon to see a company do something illegal or wrong, and then when threatened with the possibility of a lawsuit, they offer they offer reinstatement to the employee. Now, sometimes the employee is willing to go back, but there are other times when, because of the circumstances surrounding the termination, the employee doesn't feel comfortable going back. Um, there is a legal tactic known as an unconditional offer of reinstatement. I don't want to get too technical, but why don't you kind of explain that? And also, why don't you kind of explain what, if any, sort of potential claims this person might have based upon what happened here?
Yeah, I mean, an unconditional offer of reinstatement, the unconditional part of it means I'm going to give you your job back, and in return, you do not have to give me a release. So if you're suing me or you're pursuing something, you can still do that. It's not a condition of you coming back to work. The law tends to recognize that as a point where your damages might kind of end, because employment cases are really tied primarily to your financial loss, and there's sort of a duty on the part of the employee to avoid just continuing to accumulate loss by being unemployed. Um, there's definitely situations where offers of reinstatement can be reasonably rejected. Then it becomes a question of, what was the work environment like, and is it reasonable for me to say, I can never go back and work there again. We have definitely had cases where our clients have gone back to work. The only context that I myself have seen that happen in is a mistake about FMLA leave or a disability reasonable accommodation or leave, because sometimes those are genuinely a mistake. And there's not the emotional investment necessarily, or, it's not like a sexual harassment or a race discrimination kind of situation that's very personal and very upsetting. It's a mistake. And sometimes those employees are going to be more willing to say, this was a mistake. They're trying to make it right. They're giving me my job back. Maybe they'll give me my back pay, or not, maybe they will get, they'll give me my back pay, whatever. This situation could be a little bit different because obviously it's very personal. It's like a safety issue, obviously, to be chased into a bathroom. The irony again. A man has chased a actual woman into the bathroom when we're worried about who's using what bathroom. Anyway, so, maybe this is a situation where the law considers it to be perfectly reasonable for her to say, no, thank you. I don't want this job back. You can give me some kind of settlement that will make me, whole, in terms of, financially for losing my job. New York does recognize complaints for discrimination and harassment when it's a non-employee. So I think this guy was a customer of Walmart. So in New York at least, that would be something that would still be illegal. You don't only have to be harassed by a coworker in order to make a protected complaint of harassment to your boss and be protected from retaliation. And discrimination and harassment against people for being transgender is protected under federal law. I don't know if it is under Florida state law, but it is under federal law, which would apply in Florida.
Yeah, I mean, the person wasn't transgender. It's very interesting.
Right. Well, actually, so that's a good point that you just said. So also under federal law, sex discrimination includes gender stereotyping. So if a woman is harassed because she looks masculine and vice versa, if a man is kind of like effeminate and you're harassing him for that reason, that's all protected under sex discrimination. So that's actually a good point because I think that the gender stereotyping issue is going to be where we see a lot of problems arising from the anti-trans rhetoric that is very prevalent right now. Um, and I think that it's something that we touch on a lot, if not in the podcast, or sort of in our practice, and information that we kind of put out there to try to educate people. Um, we see in our practice that rhetoric translates into action. So I think a lot of people try to excuse certain types of behavior by saying it's just words. But in our practice, we see that that's not true. Like if you have a lot of words and your words are against women or against Black people or against people with disabilities, it is not shocking when that translates into action. You don't like women. Are you going to promote a woman? Probably not. Will you be more likely to fire a woman if you have a lot of bad things to say about women? Yes. We had, back in the first go around with all this, we had a grab them by the what case where somebody heard that and brought it into the workplace and said it. And when our client complained about it, they got death threats and they got their car broken into and they got fired. And that was words turning into real harm and action.
Yeah.
So I think that this Walmart case is just one of what I assume is going to be many, many examples of people being targeted based upon all this rhetoric and this, I think, frankly, probably completely unfounded fear of or at least unfounded like belief that this is happening like 100 times a day, and that it's an issue that you have to be like really worried about, this bathroom stuff. What's probably more prevalent, or it will become more prevalent, is that a woman who looks sort of masculine or is dressed a certain way is going to be harassed. And that's exactly what happened here. And I suspect that that will happen many times again because of this.
Well, look, Walmart, this ultimately, from our perspective, this comes down to like employment law and did they do the right thing or was it illegal? They recognize that they made a mistake, obviously, by trying to bring her back. Not saying it's okay, but these companies have to be aware of this. And look, I wouldn't say I'm sympathetic to Walmart because I'm not. I've litigated against them multiple times and I'm not a huge fan. Um, that said, I think it's becoming more challenging also being an employer in the face of what's happening currently in terms of the roller coaster of you know uh, policy with respect to DEI and other policies. And so I think that doesn't excuse their behavior in any way. I mean, they obviously don't, you can't fire someone for reporting a complaint. And it looks like they're trying to correct it, but I suspect that, uh, you know, this won't be the end of this case. She wants to make a point and it's appropriate, and that looks like that's what's going to happen. So, all right. Anything else on that?
No, I mean, I just see I'm fired up because the McAfee guy going after this like freshman, is that his name?
McAfee.
Going
Yeah.
after the freshman girl. So now I'm gonna be fired up about this too.
All right. Well, you can be fired up about this because my favorite show, well, I have two favorite shows currently, The White Lotus, which is, even though it's slow, is amazing. And The Pit, which we just finished watching with our daughter. If you haven't seen it, go watch it. It's incredible. And it's also now getting sued by the estate of Michael Crichton, who I knew that I think I probably knew this, but he was apparently a Harvard med graduate and decided to give up a career in medicine to become a writer. Um, and then
Well,
wrote,
watching the pit, I feel like that was the right move because it makes
yeah,
being
well, that's
a
true.
doctor like simultaneously heroic and like a job, at least in the context that they're in the emergency room, that I wouldn't have like last 10 minutes in there.
Well, all right. So here's my comments on that. So The Pit, for those who don't know, is a show about an emergency room in Pittsburgh, a trauma center emergency room, and really it takes place over the course of one day. So each episode is an hour, and it's really, I think, an accurate portrayal slash indictment on the current state of the medical system in the United States, and it addresses all kinds of things from budgetary concerns to staffing issues to the real problem that's happening in the healthcare system when uh, surgery centers are being developed and highly profitable surgeries are being moved out of hospitals, leaving less revenue for hospitals, making it harder for them to treat patients in a proper way, to violence against healthcare
Don't give any
providers.
spoilers.
What?
Don't give any spoilers.
I'm not. I'm talking about all the issues. Anyway, so part of our practice is handling negligence cases and occasionally a malpractice case. And you know, I've had a number of cases that were where somebody got really hurt in part because of probably a shortage of medical staff, and because of that, people were not paying attention and mistakes happened, often, bad ones. And so, watching the show, even doing what I do, we have nurses in our family, we have doctors in our family, so you're sympathetic to the system. It really is a very moving show on a number of levels. The long and the short of it is, it's also apparently a ripoff of of ER, and it's being sued by the estate of Michael Crichton because apparently Warner Brothers approached the estate not long ago and was in talks to actually do a spinoff of ER. Uh, and when those talks broke down, Warner Brothers just went ahead and made The Pit, which is basically a spinoff of ER. And so now there's litigation. A lawsuit was filed in California, and the Warner Brothers filed a motion to dismiss the case, citing what we talked about in a prior episode as an anti-SLAPP law, which is meant to protect residents of California from lawsuits that target free speech. Not quite sure how that applies.
Yeah, I mean, usually we see that, like, the reason why it's come up before is because, like, you were joking before that this is becoming like a defamation podcast. It's usually SLAPP stands for strategic lawsuits against public participation. So in addition to defamation situations, you see it when, like, say you go to a planning board meeting or something and, you say something, you're supposed to be kind of protected and allowed to speak freely in those types of situations without getting sued. And then, with defamation, we see defamation cases are used when they, in an abusive way, when, say, for example, like the Johnny Depp lost trial, he was ultimately successful in that. But when you sue a woman or an accuser for defamation because she, claims that you abused her in some way, SLAPP statutes are intended to kind of cut down on abuse in that way. So I don't know if the one in California is more broad, that where they said it's just kind of like broadly protects like First Amendment types of issues, but they tried to use it unsuccessfully here to block this lawsuit.
Yeah, and that's the long and the short of it, that the judge said the court finds the evidence submitted by plaintiffs meets the minimal merit standard to demonstrate at least a prima facie case. That means they might be able to prove their case that the pit is derived from ER. And so the case is going to go forward. All I know is that I hope this doesn't somehow stop the pit from
I
coming
just
out of
don't
the
want the
second
pit to be
season.
canceled.
This is like the unintended or maybe intended consequences of lawsuits. Um, I, you know, it's a great show. So hopefully, often in these cases, they wouldn't actually apply for an injunction to prevent the case from going forward. What they'd apply for, and if they were thinking it through, which I'm sure they are, they would really want to just get a piece of the royalties of this, because the show is extremely popular, well reviewed, and they could probably make more money by getting royalties than they would if they were just going to try to shut it down. So.
And I think what was compelling in the article, and I guess this remains to be seen if it's true or if they have any proof of this, but she basically said that the pitch for the ER reboot is what this show is. So they're trying to say, this is like a totally different thing and it's in the post-COVID world, and that's all true. But I mean, if they pitch this exact scenario, to her, and then that if she has proof of that, I thought that was like a compelling piece of it, as opposed to just her saying, hey, this is similar,
Yeah.
obviously, because they make a good point when they say, well, every medical show is pretty somewhat similar to each other. But if this exact, the 24-hour sort of format, if that's what was pitched to her, then those are kind of the distinguishing features of the show.
Probably doesn't help that they cast Noah Wiley, who was in the original ER.
Yeah, and I think he's like an executive producer of this show also.
Oh man. All right. I think that does it. You can go and process your anger about the Pat McAfee show and boycott it. Anything
Boy,
else?
I don't think he's gonna feel the effects of my
Hey,
boycott.
anything else this week?
Second husband, Bill Simmons, isn't involved in that show, is he?
No, I suspect, but Bill Simmons left ESPN a long time ago. To start, it's kind of actually a website that originally a website that was very similar to The Athletic, and now he does The Ringer, which is more pop culture based. But no, I suspect I would.
I don't
My
think
guess
Bill
would be
would
that.
talk like that. He wouldn't talk like that.
I mean, my guess would be that he's not a huge fan of McAfee because he doesn't do real journalism. He just kind of talks. I don't know. Anyway, all right. Anything else before we wrap it?
No.
Okay. Thank you for listening. There's lots of new stories coming along, so we'll be back again soon. Questions, again, hit us up at TalkLex Podcast. And thanks again for listening.